everyone. So I think we are live now with the Q&A portion. Thank you so much for joining our presentation on Safe at Home. And I think we've got the next 15 minutes or so to answer some of the questions coming in through the chat.
And we definitely are getting some questions, so this is great. And I might just go ahead and read a couple of questions, and Lauren and Alyssa maybe figure out between the two of you which one it's more suited to, and we'll just do this as a conversation. So thank you so much. Helen's asked a question about unique factors to consider when looking at safe at home programs between rural and urban regions, and maybe the differences between the two.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question, because I think geography plays a really big role in the design of safe at home program models. And so one of the biggest factors I think that happens in rural communities is related to the security measures component or the emergency response component of safe at home. So often in the program model, people are provided with emergency alarm devices that they can activate and call for an emergency response to support their safety when they're living on their own. And in a lot of communities, the response time for this device will not necessarily provide enough quick turnaround or security for the survivor. And we definitely did hear this from some of our participants from rural communities. There is, excitingly though, a pilot program happening in rural Alberta right now, and they've just got underway earlier this year, testing out a safe at home model in that type of community. So I think that'll be something to really keep an eye on and stay tuned for some of the results coming out of that program to understand how this model can be adapted to rural communities for sure. I don't know, Lauren, if there was anything you wanted to add on that.
No, that was great.
Fantastic. And another question has to do with neighbors and what role do neighbors play in these programs?
Yeah, so I would say neighbors are not necessarily a formal partner within safe at home programs, but they definitely have an informal role to play. And we heard a lot from participants about community safety, and that was a really big factor, even outside of the supports that the program model could provide itself, whether the survivor was living in somewhere they felt was a safe building or a safe neighborhood really was a big determinant of whether they'd feel comfortable with independent living. We did hear definitely some stories about great neighbors. Some survivors really wanted to share their circumstances with people living around them so that they could play a role in identifying if perhaps the perpetrator were to return to the area or to their unit, or to even connect more informally for social supports or peer supports to understand kind of what they were experiencing. So yeah, I think it's something to keep in mind about who can provide that community safety aspect outside of the immediate program components.
I don't know if Lauren, you wanted to add anything or?
I think, yeah, with it even connects back to your previous question, Helen, around the rural and urban factors, that neighbors and that community support would really be important in rural areas because of those other safety concerns.
Sorry, there was a lag there for some reason. I don't know why. Helen's asked another question just about folks who have to stay in their space and how to deal with harmful effects when the physical environment can't be changed.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that was something that really came forward from survivors, especially those who did stay in their own home. There was a lot of comments around trauma being attached to the space. And for some people, there were strategies that could really mitigate that to the point where they felt comfortable staying, whether that was changing the look, changing some of the furniture, rearranging things, that kind of thing. For others, it was just more of a non-starter, that for them a fresh start meant going to a new space and that there wasn't anything that could be done to remove those reminders or make them feel comfortable in their shared home. So I think that piece really stresses why we've taken that wider definition of safe at home programs, recognizing that for some women, remaining in the shared home is just not an appropriate option. And we still want this program model to be accessible for people who do prefer to move directly to independent housing. So it's definitely a big consideration. And it was something, to be quite honest, that came as a bit of a surprise for me in hearing some stories from survivors, because in the literature literature review, when we looked at the key components of the model, changing the physical home and the look of it wasn't something that came forward as a core component. So that was something that really came out of the primary research and was very exciting to hear a new important idea coming from the survivors that we spoke to.
And a great way to sort of take a look at it and say, okay, let's pivot in this case, right? We really need to adapt and be responsive to what's necessary in the situation. Yeah,
Exactly.
for sure. If anybody has any other questions, please keep putting them in the Q&A. I'm going to just scan the chat really quickly and see if there's anything. A lot of people just saying thank you so much. A great presentation and so much to think about. But I am looking for some more questions and comments. If anybody has any, because we can really dig into this. We've got Lauren and Alyssa here right now. Ask whatever it is that's burning on your mind, because they're right here for you. And I don't want to miss that opportunity because it's such a great thing. We do have a question about formalized partnerships and collaboration and best practices. Are there suggestions and advice on agency shared consent forms? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think that comes back to some of the best practices that we would want to see in program design. So one of the key principles of any safe at home program is to be trauma informed and to have all partners involved be very well versed in trauma informed practice. And a big part of that would be not needing clients to constantly repeat their story and to share it with multiple different agencies, multiple different staff members. And so part of the model structure is that it generally has a central point of intake, whether that's through a community agency when you're accessing services or through law enforcement who might be responding to a particular incident. And so at that point of time where you're entering the program and determining eligibility for the program, that would hopefully be the only point at which kind of that check-in about traumatic experience is shared. But then going forward from that, most safe at home programs have a dedicated coordinator who is in charge of kind of those consent and referral pieces. And so they would be the one managing the connection to all those other wraparound supports.
Yeah, that's so important, that minimizing the trauma that people experience. It's hard enough to get to that point without having to just continually tell a story over and over again. Yeah, we have a question from Hillary about whether or not your program is only available in Ontario at this point.
Yeah, so within our work, we're not delivering any program at this point. So we're more on the research side of things, trying to understand what this could look like. Is it something survivors want? And if so, how would it could be best designed going forward? And some of our next steps are then more on the policy and capacity building side. So trying to think about how we can set up the system and those kind of prerequisites to be in place to then design this type of program. So when we are doing that policy work, just because at where we're based, it will have more of an Ontario lens. But I think a lot of the kind of general best practices in program design would be applicable across Canada. And so looking to see kind of which communities can maybe start things off, but then have an eye on translating or scaling that to lots of different communities.
So starting it out because it's based, because the research and everything is based in Ontario, but having it so that it's replicable elsewhere. Absolutely. And we need to keep our eyes on it so that this can happen in other places. I'm in Nova Scotia, I think, absolutely. Right. So
yeah, and I know, so the two that we're sort of familiar with, and there might be more out there. So this is also a call to anyone listening. If you're aware of any programs like this or pilots going on similar to Safe at Home, we'd love to hear about them. The two we are familiar with is the one I mentioned happening in rural Alberta. Then there's also a program not quite at the point of implementation, but more in the design and stakeholder planning stage out of Hamilton, Ontario. So those are the two we've got our eyes on, but would love to learn about more if anyone listening right now knows of any other programs.
And I'm just scanning the chat as we're sitting here, hoping that if anybody does know anything, that they pop it in the chat and let us know what's going on. I'm just watching the questions, and we don't have any other questions coming in, but what I'd love to hear from the two of you are any sort of other thoughts, anything as you were putting the presentation together, anything that maybe stands out that you still want to really accentuate or talk about, because there's so much.
Lauren, I'm happy for you to jump in first. I've been jumping in quite quickly, so you go for it.
Right? Yeah. If you have anything on the top of
I'm
your
happy
head,
to start
go
us off
ahead,
if you
Alyssa.
prefer.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, I think the one thing that maybe stood out to me that I would love people to kind of walk away with, there's two things that come to mind actually. One is a bit around some of the framing that we think about when we think about women's housing when they're leaving violence, that it's not just sort of about safety, but it's also about, you know, what women want and the appeal and the desire of different housing options. And I think that's one of the data points that really stood out to me, was that sometimes the housing options that people perceive as safe don't align with the options that actually appeal the most to them. So trying to broaden our understanding and our kind of what the types of programs that we fund, the types of housing that we build, to really consider some of those perspectives as well. And with that in mind, like a huge thank you to our research participants for sharing those perspectives that can really guide this. I think the only other thing that comes to mind for me is just to really stress something that we mentioned towards the beginning of the presentation, that Safe at Home is just one of the many housing options that we've needed. And I've heard this, I think, in the couple other sessions that have happened so far, that we need a range of housing approaches. There are a lot of diverse experiences of women in general, and also women with experiences of intimate partner violence. So this type of program isn't to say it's kind of that one solution that's really going to get us there. It's just one of the things that we need to have on the table to offer as an option.
Absolutely. I think that we have to remember that, you know, not everybody is having that same experience. And so what works for one person is not going to work for everybody.
Exactly. Yeah.
Being nimble to that and being responsive to the needs of such a wide variety. And I think that fits into the trauma-informed piece too, because we can get caught up in pigeonholing a situation or a prototype of a person that we think this is going to fit. And that's a fire trap. Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm just looking to see, I thought that another question popped up, but again, just the comments in the chat are just saying that this is inspiring. And I think that it's food for thought for a lot of people. Really good stuff.
No, and I will kind of shout it back to everyone in the community and a lot of frontline workers and even survivors who have been implementing these kinds of models informally for many, many years. So again, just to stress, like, these ideas aren't new. They've been going on in the community for a long time, but we're hoping that we can move some things forward in terms of formalizing this as a more frequent housing option that's offered for survivors.
For sure. Lauren, were there any other takeaways from you as we're sort of winding up this session and sort of thinking about what's next?
I think it's just this presentation just also stresses the importance of having it survivor led, you know, as both of you were saying, that we don't know what will work for everyone and it's not one size fits all. So making sure we have survivors' voices at the forefront to know, okay, is this going to work? What is this, you know, most appealing option to you compared to what the safest option or what is assumed to be the safest option?
Right. Really tailoring it.
Mm-hmm.
It's a huge piece of all of this for sure. Do we have any other questions or comments that people would like to bring forward as we start to wind down today? And I've really only just come in. I know that I wasn't the moderator that started, so if I look discombobulated when folks came in, it really is because I am discombobulated right now. But thank you so much. And
no, thank you for popping in. And I don't think anyone would have known unless you pointed it out. That was very smooth.
Well, and yeah, we have another comment that just says the graphs are easy to understand. Thank you for that. Yeah, and Helen said, I recently attended a workshop about the shadow pandemic. And this was a great compliment to that. So thank you. Yeah. All right. Well, I think that we have, normally the moderators would have a little guide to tell you what's next. But since I'm not supposed to be moderating right now, I cannot tell you what's next without like scrambling on my screen. So what I would suggest is that as people leave this presentation today, they go back to the main dashboard to see what's next. I want to thank the two of you so much for being here today and for giving us this information, giving us so much to think about. And I'd like to also thank all of the attendees for, their support of what you're doing. And I would say keep watching, because, this is something that is, I want to see what comes next from this, right? Yeah. And so thank you so much for that. And thank you for the attendees. And I wish everybody the best as they continue on with their day and tomorrow's deliberations as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for attending.
Yeah.